Welcome to the Sage Women podcast, hosted by Melanie White and Dr. Nick Engera. We have real conversations with real women, health professionals, and coaches who share stories about perimenopause, menopause, and a range of women's health issues. Please subscribe so you get the latest updates every fortnight.
It's Melanie White here from the Sage Women podcast, and I'm very excited to introduce Wendy Sweet, who is an exercise physiologist from New Zealand with a PhD and a women's healthy aging expert from New Zealand. She studied at Otago University and the University of Waikato, I think I've pronounced that correctly, and delivers training and education to coaches and individuals in over 50 countries. So I've been hearing about you for years, Wendy, from a whole bunch of different people, and I'm very excited to have you here today.
Well, thank you, Melanie, and to everybody, kia ora koutou from New Zealand, which means welcome. I haven't got a lot of time, so I'm going to take you on a journey, and that journey is both a personal and professional journey. So thank you, Melanie, for giving me this opportunity. I know that you guys do a fantastic job, in Australia, across the ditch, as we say, and I just want to be able to add to this menopause narrative. So Melanie's asked me to present, and I said to her that what I really focus on is really an individual approach to menopause in terms of lifestyle science. As I say, my PhD was on women's health and aging, and over the past 10 years, I've been setting up my menopause transformation, and it all started over there in Australia. I'm way down in the South Island of New Zealand, but it started for me in Australia. It was 2016, and I was doing my PhD on women's health and aging. My PhD wasn't on menopause, but that's the path that it's led me down, because I was talking to women from around the country, around New Zealand, who are aged between 50 and 62 years. And the stories they told me was phenomenal. So as part of my PhD, I was invited to speak to the World Health Organization, the very first Congress that was held in Melbourne, Australia, on aging and health. Professor John Beard and his team from Geneva, or he's from Australia, but they were working in Geneva, were really interested in the aging of the population. And there I was crossing the bridge going to the Melbourne Conference Centre, and I had plantar fasciitis at the bottom of my feet. I had sore knees. I was hobbling across that bridge. I'd hardly slept the night before. I was 51 years old. And I thought my anxiety was just because I was really being asked to present at this really high level academic conference. And what I was talking about was the meanings that women had been given to their aging. I'd been talking to women around the country, and this is the sort of thing that they were telling me. I felt tired, overweight, my joints ached all over, but they were still doing a lot of exercise. In fact, nearly every single one of them had positioned their health and aging in doing lots of exercise. But these were the stories they were telling me. There's Diane. I ended up on all sorts of medications for heart health. But the worst thing was I was so tired all the time. And this word tired and fatigue kept coming in, as did sore joints. And I loved to travel, and I had to give up my exercise. And this really resonated with me, because part of my choice for doing my PhD was because I was attending a conference up in America. It was to do with education and the exercise industry. In my previous life, I've been a nurse, an ICU nurse, and then I retrained. And I set up the personal training industry in New Zealand for the Les Mills Group. So I'd been in and out of the fitness industry and fitness industry education for many, many years. And as part of my master's study, I did a research on lifestyle behavior change within the exercise context. So I was up in America attending a conference, and this conference was all about the education gaps for practitioners who were working with women. And it was really interesting because the head of Curves International, that's a women's health club, she managed 10,000 health clubs between America and Canada. And she said to me, I don't know what's going on, but women between the ages of 45 and 55 are the highest cohort to join our clubs. However, they're also the highest cohort to leave. And it had been really fascinating because I had been talking to women around the country in New Zealand. This is Deb, she's a personal trainer here in New Zealand. And women were talking about giving up their jobs because they really weren't understanding what was going on at this stage of life. And it was really fascinating because after I gave my presentation, I was at the conference and I started walking around some of the other presentations. And there was Professor Rosemary Stanton. Those of you in Australia will have heard of her. And here she was talking about this perfect storm that was happening around nutrition for women and men, but primarily women in their midlife years. And I'll talk to you about what midlife is and what menopause is shortly, but I just want to tell you how I got there. And she was talking about the fact that there was so much inflammation in our gut, in the gut health of women that they were studying. And this was because we are the first generation to go into perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause, so somewhere between 45 and 60 years of age. We're the first generation to go into menopause in light of the huge social changes around food, processing, and certainly the types of diets that people have been eating. So a lot of these researchers were talking about the clinical endpoints. And there was Professor Rosemary Stanton. I was listening to her presentation, and she was opening up my mind to these changes in gut health. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm talking about gut health right at the start of a menopause presentation. But hang on a minute, it'll all make sense shortly. And it was fascinating because a lot of the women on my studies had told me about changing gut health. And certainly it's something that's come through over the past 10 years in terms of the work that I do with women around the world. So here she was talking about this huge increase in irritable bowel syndrome, 4 times more common in females as they reach their 50s. And I was listening away to this conversation. And then, of course, I started to open up my mind. And I had a few light bulb moments as I was sitting in this conference, because there was these wonderful presenters talking about the gut health microbiome, insomnia, circadian disturbance, I'll go into that shortly, and depression. And I became very intrigued because nobody had spoken to me about my anxiety, my feelings of, mood swings all over the place, and also a lot of the gut health inflammation that I'd been experiencing as well as I arrived in my early 50s. And yet this was the first time that I'd really heard about this gut health brain connection and the implication in terms of serotonin and how these changes start to accelerate, particularly in women as they come through their late 40s and into their early 50s. And we know, many of you are either experiencing this yourself or you're coaching it. And we know that many of the symptoms of menopause per se, and I'll explain what that is shortly, includes brain fog, anxiety, mood swings, and depression. And yes, menopause hormone replacement therapy is come through as the gold standard for anxiety, brain fog, and mood swings. And it was really interesting to me because, when I went on HRT, I'm not on it now, but nobody talked to me about my gut health. So I became very curious about a lot of the symptoms that were given this, this kind of label of menopause symptoms. But when you break them down, there's so much more going on. And I became absolutely fascinated with the fact that the women on my PhD were telling me about all these symptoms, but they weren't mentioning the word menopause. They were looking at all of their symptoms in isolation, and that still happens today. And here we are, 2/3 of women in the United Kingdom, Australia, and here in New Zealand are put on antidepressants in their early 50s. And yet when we look at the research, I know from exercise physiology, there's a phenomenal amount of research around aerobic exercise, moderate aerobic exercise. And here's another fabulous Australian researcher, Professor Felice Jacker, who runs the SMILE trial in Australia, has done that for many years. And she kept talking about this inflammation. She was presenting at that conference, and I've since heard her at numerous lifestyle medicine conferences. And she talked about the gut microbiota. She talked about inflammation, and she talked about the phenomenal changes in diet, plus the solutions around the type of foods that we should be eating, particularly around improving anxiety, mood swings, depression, and some of those symptoms that are ever present as we come through menopause. And I began to understand too that there is such a lot of interdisciplinary research. And by that I mean when you look at all the different research, from exercise to nutrition to sleep research to liver health research and gut health research, they all mention the symptoms of menopause. And I'm thinking, wow, this is phenomenal. And of course, one of the things that has really resonated with me in terms of doing my doctoral studies is that as I was at this conference, they were talking about older adults. And I'm sorry to tell you this, but every single slide that they were presenting on their data for a lot of these inflammatory changes that speed up when we get to midlife, every single PowerPoint slide that researchers from around the world were presenting on in terms of aging started at the age of 45 to 50. And I thought, wow, here I was sitting in the audience, and I thought, wow, I've never thought of myself as an older person. But that's what they were referring to us as. And I thought, this is fascinating, because inside, our cells and tissues are aging, but in our brain, we still feel as if we're 30 years old. And that started me on this fascinating journey about what is normal aging, what is normal, and what is going on. And one of the things that I really reflected on, certainly from a physiology perspective, I've taught physiology for over 15 years at the University of Waikato, certainly around exercise and sports science. And what I began to do was start to look at every single symptom of menopause and start to think about why they are happening. Because menopause in itself is an absolutely normal transition that every single woman in the world goes through, including whales, and now scientists have found that chimpanzees too. And I've found things like there's so much research on low vitamin D3. And yet you think about the fact that here in Australia and New Zealand over summer we're exposed to a lot of sun, but yet we're not exposed to sun when it's too hot. There's Brenda in Tasmania. She was an author and wasn't getting out in the sun. And yet our skin is changing. It's our largest organ that protects our immune system. And in women especially, vitamin D starts to be less absorbed. And if I had my way, a vitamin D blood test would be the number one test that women are taken through. Here in New Zealand, you have to pay for it. I don't think you do in Australia, but certainly in New Zealand, it's not offered. And then, of course, there's anxiety and heart palpitations. I don't know if any of you have experienced these, but certainly as someone who's worked in intensive care and coronary care many, many years ago, I was really concerned about my heart palpitations. My doctor didn't have a reason, and I went and was tested and nothing was wrong. And yet when I went up to the States to attend a conference on health and aging, there was the late Dr. Stephen Sinatra, a cardiologist, talking about this phenomenal change in coenzyme Q10 or ubiquinol that occurs with our cardiac muscle, particularly in women who've done a lot of exercise. Now, we're the first generation, or women in the early 60s today, me, we were the pioneers of the fitness industry. And never before have so many women come into menopause, and certainly post-menopause, with the changes in the exercise environment. And yet we're not understanding that we're carrying a lot of that inflammation from our past years into this next phase of our life. So I became fascinated with, again, these other symptoms. And I learned that in terms of anxiety and certainly mood swings, there is so much lifestyle medicine evidence around B vitamins. And if you go and look at all the different supplements that are being sold to women in menopause, then certainly the B vitamins are very apparent in many of these supplements. And one of the things that happens as part of our normal aging is that our nerves change. The myelin sheath around the outer part of the nerve starts to reduce its ability to receive estrogen as estrogen declines, and that causes some brain irritability. So our brain fog, our confusion, our anxiety, our loss of memory is often due to this changes in the conduction of the nerves. And that changes the impact of the work of vitamin B, the B vitamins on the brain and the brain nerves. And we know in women who are pregnant and certainly when we're younger, we know the importance of folate, but we're not getting told this as we come into menopause. So there's some parsley and some rocket out of my garden. There's so much research on folate and nerve health and brain health as we come through menopause. It needs to be taken with omega-3 fats, which is your salmon and your fatty fish. And here in New Zealand, I get a lot of my ladies on good old-fashioned Floridix. So a lot of this stuff I was becoming aware of over the years. And then, of course, there's the sleep. It is one of the hallmark symptoms of menopause. And again, it gets thrown into this basket of all of these menopause symptoms. And believe me, I know what it's like to be awake between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning, particularly that feeling that you need to get up and pee all the time. And I began to understand that there's a lot of sleep research. So when I kept thinking about how do we sleep, what is going on with sleep as we come through menopause, and yes, as estrogen starts to decline and we're going into this reproductive, change, then this affects melatonin, our sleep hormone. But melatonin works with cortisol, which is also our stress hormone. So when melatonin needs to be high in the evening, cortisol, our stress hormone, should be low. So there's a lot of evidence around the fact that our modern lifestyle impacts cortisol. So does alcohol consumption in the evening. Sorry to tell you that. But there's other things going on as well. And I was really fascinated with the fact that if women have got hot flushes and not sleeping and they've got night sweats overnight, or they've got a busy brain, then there is so much research in the cardiovascular research or the cardiac research around high blood pressure. And this fascinated me because in the hot flush research, the hot flush, I can say hot flush, I've got to say hot flashes when I'm presenting overseas, or vasomotor symptoms, that's what hot flushes or hot flashes are called. And these are now known to be associated with high blood pressure overnight. And I'm going, wow, that is fascinating, because here in New Zealand and Australia, we're not talking enough about cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular risk or heart health. And yet it is the number one health issue when you look further down the track at healthy aging or unhealthy aging. And this is something that I believe isn't getting enough attention as we come through our midlife years from 45 to 60. And there I was at this conference back in Melbourne, and there I was sitting in another presentation on the inflammatory theory of aging. Now, my PhD was on aging, so this piqued my interest because I had been reading a lot about inflammation and these different theories of aging, which kind of give a framework for explaining how we age. And certainly as we come through our midlife years, there's Australian gerontologist, and she's an exercise physiologist, Professor Maria Fertirones-Singh, and she was discussing those clinical endpoints that we've seen in our parents' generation, the inflammation that leads to dementia, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, and osteoporosis. And my ears pricked up because we know osteoporosis and cardiovascular disease, as well as dementia and Alzheimer's, this is what the manufacturers or the doctors are concerned about, and this is why we're being told to go on hormone replacement therapy. And which it was really fascinating because she was talking about the fact that many of these changes in inflammation actually occur in our midlife years, in perimenopause and menopause. But here's what she said. We now know enough about how many of the conditions of inflammation and changing vascular status, which is blood vessel status, in our elderly begin to occur a lot earlier than we think. In fact, in women especially, the changes to blood vessel or vascular status occur in the menopause transition. And I'm going, wow, here I was 51, here I was, joining the dots going, this is fascinating because this is what I'm reading about in my research. And there's world-renowned women's cardiologist, Professor Angela Maas from the Netherlands. And as she says, around the age of 60 years, more than a third of women develop hypertension. Many say it's as if the menopause has come back in full force. And I see this, I've seen this for the last decade in women who come into my own 12-week programs who are post-menopause. They're still on HRT, but they're still getting hot flushes and they've got high blood pressure. And what I've realized is that nobody's talking about this vascular or arterial stiffness. And yet when you follow the nutrition research, we know that there are compounds in purple foods, particularly beetroot and black currants. Here in New Zealand, a lot of the black currants go off to Japan because because Japan is one of the highest rates of high blood pressure in the world, but low rates of cardiovascular disease. And yes, some of that's attributed to smoking and stress, but it's really fascinating that here's a lot of these other countries that don't have the menopause concerns that we have in many Western countries, and yet they're having a lot of these purple foods. So we know that these anthocyanins and compounds in beetroot and black currants avert oxidative stress in blood vessels and help to reduce blood pressure. So why aren't we including this as part of our nutrition information around women's health? And we also know there's Dr. Jumana Saleh. She's a biologist, but really specializes in women's heart health. She was opening up my mind to this change in iron levels. And for the first time ever, I thought, wow, this makes so much sense. Because in perimenopause, we're still menstruating, or we should be. And then in postmenopause, we're not menstruating. So there's this huge shift in iron levels between perimenopause to postmenopause, which is why I get a little bit annoyed when we're all thrown into the one menopause basket. But there's 3 different phases of menopause. So she brought my attention to the fact that here we are, in perimenopause, we should be focusing on these nutrients from a lifestyle perspective: our iron, our B12, zinc, selenium, and magnesium. I would add iodine in there as well for the thyroid. So we need up to 12 to 14 milligrams a day in perimenopause. But as our periods change and we go into that follicular decline or ovarian decline in postmenopause, then we can drop down to 8 milligrams a day. So to me, perimenopause is a time when we really should be focusing on, on if women aren't vegan or vegetarian, having a little bit of red meat, particularly if they're exercising. But in postmenopause, we should be starting to change our diet again. So I became very intrigued about this role of vascular stiffness and high blood pressure, because we all know, as I said earlier, from our mother's generation, that it's such a problem here in New Zealand and Australia. It's the highest health risk ahead of breast cancer and osteoporosis, but we're not talking enough about heart health. And so we know that when women have high blood pressure, when they're not sleeping, when they're feeling anxious, or if they've got sore joints, then they're in and out of exercise. And here was Professor Wendy Brown, who's run the Australian longitudinal women's health studies for over 30 years. She was presenting on the fact that women are stepping out of exercise in terms of aerobic exercise in their early 50s. And I thought, wow, that's what I was hearing happening in America and Canada. And I've seen it anecdotally in the fitness industry here in New Zealand as well. And of course, if we're not exercising in the right way for our health as we age, then that can be problematic further down the track. And there's another Australian, all these fabulous Australian researchers. It's wonderful. But Gary Eager, I've worked with Gary over the years. And here he was in this conference talking about this new terminology, which is becoming a bit more apparent now. But at the time in 2016, I wasn't associating my own menopause symptoms with this word inflammaging. And what that means is the work that Gary has done and Professor John Dixon here in Auckland, New Zealand, what they've done is they've understood that these inflammatory changes as we come through menopause, men and women, so if you've got partners who are of that age, then you need to talk to them about inflammaging. They start to accelerate, particularly as women go from menopause, when periods end, to post-menopause, when periods have ended for a year or more. And this inflammaging are the normal changes that go on around the body, not just in our ovaries and our reproductive system, but around the body. And this is what researchers are now focused on. And there's Gary and John Dixon from Auckland, New Zealand. They looked at all the inflammatory factors that affect midlife women and men, but over our lifetime. And I'm going, wow, too much exercise, or conversely, not enough exercise. Look at all the nutrition, alcohol, too much food, excessive energy intake, fat, and yet we're all being told to go on the keto diet, sugar, and never before have we had so much access to sugary foods and processed foods, too much salt, which of course affects blood pressure, sleep deprivation. Well, how many of us have had that over the years, particularly if you've got, young children or you've got a lot of things going on in your life? And of course, stress. And I think our generation invented that word stress and burnout and anxiety and depression. And so then what Gary and John did was that they then said, well, what should we do to mitigate all these changes in inflammation and to slow down the rate of aging or inflammaging? And look at all of these things. And they sit alongside many of these strategies that I have in my programs, and certainly those changes to our diet that we need. So once, I was immersed in a lot of these conversations, a lot of the research with my women's health and aging study. And what I began to understand was, how come nobody's talking about lifestyle change? Yes, we've got a lot of change going on around hormone replacement therapy. We've got Dr. Louise Newson and we've got the NICE guidelines. The rate of HRT prescription has increased 45% in the UK in the past 2 years. And yet nobody's talking about lifestyle. Nobody's talking about the fact that overweight and obese women have fat cells that produce their own estradiol. Nobody's positioning menopause in the aging science and saying, what can we do to change our lifestyle? And we now know that the perimenopause transition is an inflammatory part of our lifestyle when we don't get it right. So that became my passion. My passion and my purpose is to take all of these symptoms that occur around the body and take a holistic approach to menopause, not just looking at our ovaries. And I found out that with all the sore joints that women experience, me as well, we're not being told about the fabulous research from the Olive Wellness Research Institute there in Australia and the work that's been done around the Mediterranean diet and osteoarthritis for extra virgin olive oil. fascinating research, and I call this our HRT, our natural HRT, 20 mils a day of extra virgin olive oil. It helps your nerves, it reduces anxiety, it helps your joint health, and now we know that melatonin is present in extra virgin olive oil. So why are we putting all these other oils on the table? This is the one we should do. And then, of course, the work around heart health. And if we just use that perception of heart health and we say, right, what do we need to be telling women about their heart health? Well, the first thing is the fabulous work that's been done around lycopene, and certainly in tomatoes and lots of other foods. Women should be having cooked tomatoes nearly every day for their heart health, because the levels need to be elevated throughout the week. And then the fabulous work with blood pressure around citrus fruit juices and lemons and blood oranges and all of those types of food. So this all leads towards the question that I had to ask myself, which was, what is the best diet for me as I arrive in my 50s, and to help me mitigate the effects of inflammation? And all roads lead to the Mediterranean diet. And you don't know how freeing that is, because every time someone mentions keto or paleo or any other crazy diet, I just don't even listen, because they're not looking at menopausal women and older women and cardiovascular health. So keep that in mind. And of course, the template that I've been able to use through the fabulous work of Dan Buettner is some of the Blue Zones studies. If you haven't seen the Netflix documentary, then make sure you put it on your list to have a look at it. And I became fascinated with the woman. Yes, he's looked at men as well, but I became fascinated with the woman. And these are the locations around the world. The geographical locations, Singapore has just been added in, whereby there isn't the heart disease, there's healthy aging, there's not the joint health problems. And people are living a long life in their post-reproductive years. Women are living a long life in their post-reproductive years, and they're not going on all these medications and supplements and everything. So it's been really fascinating to understand, certainly things like the Okinawa longevity studies and the types of foods that Okinawa women are eating. They're eating for their energy. They're eating healthy carbohydrates, sweet potatoes. They're eating a range of foods and way less protein than we're eating here in New Zealand and Australia. And again, I became really interested in the role of nutrition, and I go into that a lot in my programs and my food guide. So there I was looking at all of these different symptoms, and you can open up any medical textbook and say, gosh, there's all these symptoms, and women kind of, they can be quite insidious. They can creep up on women, and they don't really think that their weight gain is to do with menopause, or they don't think that their sore joints are to do with menopause, because all of the biomedical lens is looking at all of these symptoms in isolation. And I became quite fascinated because my doctor was as well. And then, of course, there's the invisible stuff going on, the high cholesterol, the low ferritin, which impacts your iron stores, the C-reactive protein, which is a marker of general inflammation, the vitamin D levels as well. And this was a lady in Australia who came on my program. And, I don't interfere with any medical recommendations. I'm not a medical doctor. But it was fascinating because the doctor didn't ask her about the exercise that she was doing. And she was doing enduro events, and she was, running with a lot of clients 5 times a week and doing a lot of high intensity exercise. So again, it's really fascinating when you start to dig a little bit deeper. So what's going on? Well, many of you will know through the work of Sage Women's Health and Melanie and her team what menopause is. It's this decline in this reproductive aging. I call it the bookend to puberty, and I love that picture that I've got there for you, because it shows that we're going into the next phase of our life. And I think that that's an acceptance that isn't talked about enough. But somewhere between 45 and 51 years old, 51 to 52 years old is the global average for menopause, for periods stopping. And somewhere between 45 to 51, we're starting to get the receptors die off on our ovaries. But it's fascinating because the master hormones are in our brain, in our pituitary, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So if we're not allowing our body to adapt, and if we're not allowing our body to reduce inflammation, all of those four hormones, estrogen, progesterone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, can get out of balance. And this is why menopause HRT is given, to kind of, allow those hormones to decline more slowly. And one of the things that I say to women is, make sure you're working with your doctor, because you need to be adjusting and titrating any HRT against your natural transition through menopause. There's a lot of women at 60 still on the same HRT dose that they were on at 45. And I think that that's a real challenge for doctors to be thinking about managing those. So if menopause is the bookend to puberty, then what's going on with all our symptoms? Well, once you look at all of the, take a life course approach to menopause, then you can start to look at the last 35, 40 years of our lives. And they have been crazy, haven't they? We're working a lot more. Women are in paid employment a lot longer. In 1970, the late 1960s and 70s, the average age of retirement for women in New Zealand and Australia was 50 years old. Well, hello, we're still going at 70, aren't we? Stress. Never before has there been so much stress and understanding of stress and the disruption to the hormones. What about exercise? Here I was in the 1980s, started with Jane Fonda, and now we're doing CrossFit. So we're training like men. We're getting told to train heavy and hard and powerful. And yet there's so much research to show that what we need to do is we need to be having more cardiovascular approach, more aerobic exercise with a little bit of strength training as well. These are some of the results of, I've been following women for, for 10 years, nearly 8 to 10 years now. My symptoms quiz goes around the world: New Zealand, Australia, the UK, Ireland, and Canada. And this is what midlife women are telling me. These are the results of all of these, the symptoms quiz. We're tired, we're sore, we're not sleeping, we've got high blood pressure, and 76% of women are putting on weight. And as I say, what they don't understand is that they need to change their lifestyle. So what do? You do what I did. And my pantry cupboard looked like a supplement shop. I took this at Boots Chemist in the UK. We think that we're going to have all these miracles, and most of these supplements are full of B vitamins, black cohosh, and red clover, which works on the nervous system. But I'm saying, are women in the wrong aisle? Should they be taking, resveratrol, coenzyme Q10, vitamin D, and taking some magnesium, particularly if they're exercising, and certainly trying to think about reducing inflammation? So what I've been able to do over many years is bring a new discussion to the menopause symptom narrative, and that is around lifestyle. That is around taking a holistic view around all those factors that contribute to inflammation. What are we doing about our diet? What are we doing to change our exercise? What are we doing to manage our stress? What are we doing to change things up a bit when we reach these midlife years, 45 to 60? And what are we doing to really manage the stress hormone cortisol, which is, causing this axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, thyroid axis, to get out of balance? And what are we doing to understand that we have the hundreds of thousands of estrogen receptors around the body that are also affected by menopause? And a lot of these estrogen receptors, the main ones are in fat tissue, particularly breast tissue, and our skin. As I say, the skin is the largest organ, but there's hundreds of thousands or millions of estrogen receptors inside our blood vessels. And so what are we doing to really change the inside? You know, the bits that we can't see. We all worry about the wobbly bits on the outside, but what's going on the inside? And when we take an anti-inflammatory approach to our lifestyle and we start to change things up a bit, then it changes our lives. We can then move into our healthy aging. You know, there's Diane in Australia. There's Sarah over in Perth, a physio. You know, she was really getting concerned because she had sore joints. She was an athlete, and she was seeing so many women in her practice who had sore joints and weren't understanding that it's, yes, you know, HRT might help that, but what are they doing about changing their lifestyle? Sarah is one of my practitioners now, and you know, and she was so concerned about herself. So my message in this very, very brief presentation is that menopause matters. And it matters because we know from our mother's generation and our, you know, the women who've gone before us, that these clinical endpoints, osteoporosis, weight gain, heart disease, fibromyalgia, arthritis, diabetes, we know from the research that these are diseases of inflammation as we get older. And they start in menopause. They start with no energy, poor sleep, mood swings, hot flushes, and sore joints. And yes, you know, millions of women are going on menopause hormone replacement therapy, but what are they doing? What are they doing about their lifestyle? What are they doing to, or what are you doing if this is you, to think about some of the changes that you should be putting in place? You know, around your sleep. I have these really great sleep routines, but sleep starts in the morning. And I think that one of the discussions I have in my own coaching, private coaching groups is, can you work with your workplace? You know, there's all this legislation changes in workplace, but I think one of the most important things that women need to do is negotiate starting work a little bit later, because you need to get up in the morning and get some light in your eyes. You need to get up in the morning and walk outside, particularly in Australia where it's too hot in the middle of the day in summer to be outside, because that light on the pineal gland resets your entire circadian rhythm. And if we can reset our circadian rhythm, then this makes so much difference to our health and our energy and our cognitive thinking throughout the day. So there's all these little things that I really challenge women about, you know, in my programs, and it's such an important thing to do. Are you drinking enough water? You know, as we come through our menopause years, then it can be really challenging in terms of our water intake, particularly if we're in meetings all day and all sorts of things. And so this is where I'm coming from, is what are you doing to make some changes to your lifestyle if you're in perimenopause, menopause, or postmenopause, and to take those changes into all aspects of your life, the home, the workplace, and of course in terms of you know, wherever you are personally. This is Nikki Deere. She works for Kerry Group over in Ireland. And she came onto my Transform Me program for weight loss, and she was really exhausted and struggling. She's got a PhD in nutrition, has worked for Kerry for 25 years, and her story's on my website, and I invite you to go and have a look at it, because she talks about the impact of menopause on her life and her working life, and the fact that you know, she didn't understand that there were some changes that she should be making around her lifestyle when it came to thinking about menopause. And what I love about Nikki is that she now has set up a menopause group in her workplace, and she's done my practitioner program, and now she brings all that she's got. You know, it's growing and growing and growing. And Kerry Group have got offices all around Europe, 27,000 staff. And now she's bringing all of that knowledge around lifestyle into her workplace, and they're working with their owners to make some changes as well. These are some other practitioners who are working around the world, and certainly you can read more about me on the website and the programs that I have. So my message to you all is, you know, I was presenting at the exercise conference here in New Zealand over the weekend, and I said to personal trainers and practitioners, I said, look, I want you to forget about the word menopause, because menopause is the same as puberty. Menopause isn't the problem. The problem is that we're not looking at it in terms of taking a life course approach. We're not looking at it in terms of what is going on as we step into the next phase of our life, what is going on with our aging. And I think the struggle for women is that they live in we all live in such an anti-aging world that we forget that it's this fantastic time of life where there are a lot of changes going on. We do feel like crap, but it is, we can take back control with the right lifestyle solutions. So it's really important that, as I say, women forget about menopause, but instead use the word inflammaging. And once you insert that word in your brain, then you can make the right choices and decisions about how you look after yourself as you come through menopause. It's fascinating that woman in Tanzania, Dr. Katie Fitzpatrick, I talk about this in my masterclass, but Dr. Katie Fitzpatrick went and lived with women in Tanzania and talked about periods and menopause and perimenopause. And she found that, I don't know how she did that for 2 years, but anyway, she found that there was no word for menopause as these women in Tanzania came through this stage of life. The only symptom they experienced was a little bit of vaginal dryness. And when they did get their periods, they rested for 2 to 3 days, and they didn't go out foraging for 6 to 8 kilometers a day, which they normally did. And they walked barefoot, and they were, had enough vitamin D. Their vitamin D, they did lots of testing on them, and their vitamin D levels were really high as well. So there we go. That was a very, Melanie, that I'll hand back over to you, but that was a very kind of brief synopsis. And if anyone wants a bit more information, then the masterclass on menopause, if you want to hear my voice again, and where I go into a bit more depth, then that's on the website. So thank you, Melanie, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Wendy.
I've gone too over time.
No, that's fantastic. I really love the way you wrapped it all together, and Sage Women's Health is definitely about lifestyle transformation, not just looking at medication or quick fixes. And I love the point that you make about inflammaging. It's such a great term because menopause is seen as such a negative, I think, these days. People are complaining about all of the things that are wrong, but as you said, it is actually an opportunity to say, well, how will I live the rest of my life, and how can I make the best use and create the best quality of life from now on?
Absolutely. And I know a lot of women feel stuck, and I get that. I have 50 emails a day from women, and they often feel stuck. But if they just start with one thing, and to me, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If we can get the foundations right, if we can get our sleep, our food, and our stress sorted, then that gives us the ability, gives us a bit more resilience to deal with all the other stuff. And, Sage Women's Health does such a fantastic job in the workplaces. And I think the more we can talk about how women are feeling and what they actually want and need to support them, because it's fabulous. I'm a great believer that we get to our 50s. Well, you can't get rid of us yet, because what we want to do is bring all of our wisdom and experience into these environments, no matter what these environments are, but these environments that we work in. And a lot of women get stuck at home, and what they say to me is, oh, I can't change my diet. My husband wants to eat a big steak and potatoes at night. And I go, you can, and he can. You just have more, you can have a tiny little bit of that steak, and you can throw some sweet potatoes in, and you can make lots of vegetables and have half your plate as vegetables. And I think it's really important that we help women on a kind of a not just a legislative level or not just a big level, but also with the minutiae of detail to help them step into making those decisions and feeling that they can take back some control.
That's perfect, Wendy. A perfect way to end this session. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And we're going to put links to your website and your social media so people can contact you if they have further inquiries or questions.
Thank you, Melanie. I really appreciate that. And thank you for listening, everyone, and have a wonderful Christmas. I can say that now because we're nearly in December.
And thanks so much for sharing your wisdom today.